afternoon. Welcome to Matrix. This is the final of our authors meet critics events that we initiated this semester. It's an occasion when the publication of a new book allows us to draw upon some of our faculty strengths to initiate, to prime a type of conversation around interdisciplinary issues across the social sciences. Before I get going and introducing the speakers, let me just say that this series will be continuing in the spring. We have some great events coming up. Let me just briefly flag them for you. We have Brandy Summers, who will be in conversation with Nikki Jones on her new book on Washington, D.C., Spatial Aesthetics. We'll have a discussion of Steve Weber's book, Block by Block, Global Governance and Cybersecurity Issues. We will have the postponed discussion of Stephanie Jones Rogers' book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. And last but not least, we'll have Rosemary Joyce's new book on nuclear waste. So all of those things are coming up. In addition to that, we have these Matrix on Point discussions, which are lunchtime informal discussions that we began this semester too, with a discussion of impeachment with Bob Reich and Erwin Chemerinsky on Brexit, Veer and others. I will be continuing those too. We have one coming up on taxation and the 1% with Gabriel Zuckman and Emmanuel Saez. We have something coming up too on homelessness. We have another event on the fate of the forests with Nancy Cluso and Chris Lesser, among others, and another event with on electoral manipulation. All issues of the moment with some people on campus. And last but not least, we have Tianna Yamata-Taylor coming, end of January, to talk about her new book, Race for Profit. Very excited about that. And in April, Adam Tooze, whose book Crashed is arguably the best book on the financial crisis. Perry Anderson doesn't think so, but what does he know? So we have a lot going on next semester. All we really need now is a film festival, and we're in business. So with no further ado then, let me introduce the speakers. Let me just say the format is as follows. I'm going to ask Wendy to begin for 15 minutes or so, and then we have two interlocutors speak 10 minutes, thereabouts. And then we typically open it up for questions, observations, take 3 or 4 from the floor, throw it back to each of them, and they can improvise and respond in whatever they wish, ways they wish. Because I have to teach at 5, I'm going to be disappearing before then, and the associate director here, Dr. Jessica Stewart, she'll handle the questioning up through 5:30 when we're done. So that's the format. Wendy Brown. None of these people need introductions, and I'm going to be incredibly brief because you don't want to listen to me. They deserve a fulsome introduction, which I'm not going to deliver. Wendy Brown, class of 36, professor of political science, arguably one of the political theorists on either side of the Atlantic. Princeton trained, taught at Santa Cruz and Williams before she came here, written extensively on continental philosophy, critical theory, Frankfurt School, Foucault, Marx, etc. More recently has been pursuing, of which this book is one part, what she refers to as neoliberal rationality and its relationship to democracy and democratic practice, world states, undoing the demos. These were predecessors of this particular book that we're going to be discussing today. Tianna Paschel teaches in sociology, African American studies, written extensively on racial ideologies, political theory, has a fantastic award-winning book, won the Barrington Moore Prize in Sociology, making black political subjects, a comparison of Brazil and Colombia, of ethno-racial identities. And last but by no means least, Professor Emerita Gillian Hart, long-term colleague of mine, who began writing about agricultural issues a long, long time ago, but in the last decade or so more actually has been writing about South Africa, more recently on the fantastic implosion of the African National Congress Party, rise of Jacob Zuma. That was her rethinking the South African crisis, and currently is doing working on a comparative project on really the rise of authoritarian right politics, South Africa, India, among others. Those are the cast of characters that we have. I'm going to turn it over to Wendy to begin. then perhaps Gillian, would you like to follow? And Tianna, you were there after. Sound okay? Yeah. Wendy, all yours.
Thank you. I'm going to stand, because otherwise I'm just talking to the front row, and this is an interesting room. First, let me offer my thanks to Michael, to Jill, and to Tianna for doing this. And then let me just say very briefly as a preface that this is the only book talk I've done on this book, because I'm something of a publisher's nightmare. I like talking about books while I'm developing them and thinking about them. But once they're done, for me, they're done. And I really don't like going back to them. I don't even like hearing about them or reading reviews about them, although I know I'm going to be engaged by what I'm going to hear today from my interlocutors. So I only said yes because, I mean, after all, Michael came out of retirement to run Matrix. The very least we can do is be part of the programming, the amazing programming that he's done. So all of that is by way of saying that what I'm going to try to do is talk about a book from an uncomfortable posture. It seems to me that what's become obvious to almost all of us now is that Trump's base, and by this I don't mean all his voters, but his base, working and lower middle class whites in the deindustrialized Midlands and South, stick by him not because he delivers on their material interests or embodies evangelical Christian virtue, but because he anoints their suffering as the culturally, socially, and economically left behind and disdained populations of the 21st century. Because their failure to thrive, their struggle with dead-end jobs, thinning paychecks, soaring housing and health costs, the carnage of opioid, depression, and obesity epidemics, of disintegrating neighborhoods, infrastructure, and schools, shuttered retail zones, and shuttered futures, and above all, a lost place in a fast-paced, ceaselessly changing, globalized world. All of this acquired in our president, a high political priest, who offered them what? False causes of their suffering, immigrants, racial minorities, feminists, secularists, globalists, bad trade deals, hip and educated coastal urbanites, political elites, but also offered them the right to express their suffering in aggrieved and bellicose tones, ungrammatical and uneducated outbursts, I'm referring to his, without regard for facts or analytic coherence, laced with unabashed sexism, racism, and xenophobia. What Nietzsche reminds us: failure, abjection, rejection, humiliation, suffering, smallness, all of these are less immiserating when they are anointed as virtuous, for example, being the real Americans, when they are given external objects of blame, and when they are given an unchecked right to lash out at those objects. The success of this strategy, it seems to me, should put to an end, once and for all, the conviction that material interests, rational choice, justice, or truth are mainly what compels such voters in late modernity. It should also put to an end the conceit that this base is merely manipulated by plutocrats, calculating megachurch leaders, Fox News, Russian troll farms. Of course, all these manipulations are in play, serious play, but they wouldn't work without the form that Trump and other right-wing demagogues, both in this land and elsewhere, have provided. Now that said, there is something even the brilliantly mobilized, lost entitlement, rancor, and resentment of neoliberalism's heartland casualties cannot explain. And that is the profoundly anti-democratic force of this hard right turn and mobilization. Its open affirmation of authoritarian leadership, its spurning of constitutionalism, balance of powers, even the ordinary rule of law. Its wholesale indifference both to foreign interference in elections and internal political corruption, the use of public power for private gain. Now, there are several ways to explain this. One could explain it through the decades of assault on democratic institutions, in the case of the US, from the Republican Party, as the constituency of that party steadily shrinks. These assaults have included, of course, gerrymandering, voter suppression, hyper-politicized courts, and manipulations of legislative process, those first openly embodied by Newt Gingrich and culminating a few years back in the Merrick Garland showdown. Another way to explain this would be the decades of declining investment in education, especially higher education, and the reduction of what remains of higher education to the value of job training. This, of course, has made America insufficiently educated for democracy, especially in complex global times. This condition is indexed, it seems to me, by a recent survey revealing that 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government, and 1/3 cannot even name one. A third possible way to explain it, of course, is the sectoralized, hyper-politicized, and unaccountable media, both social and traditional, that has substituted Manichaeanism for truth, facts, accountability, and so forth. Now, in the book, I acknowledge that all of these are extremely important contributors to our condition, but my main focus is elsewhere: the deliberate, multi-pronged neoliberal assault on the institutions, venues, practices, and values of democracy. The blueprint for this can be found in the texts of the founding neoliberal intellectuals across their different schools: the Chicago School, the Austrian School, the Freiburg School, the Virginia School. So the questions animating this particular book are the following. Neoliberalism generates extreme inequality of wealth and access through its stripped-out welfare state, privatization of public goods, regressive taxation, deregulation, union busting, and rapid deindustrialization of the North. But why does rebellion against this extreme inequality take such an anti-democratic form? This is, of course, a version of the old Frankfurt School question: why do we get a hard right instead of left response to extreme capitalist depredations and crises? But I ask the question in a non-Frankfurt School way, focusing on the order of governing reason and the specific form of liberalism from which this retort took shape, rather than, as the Frankfurt School did, on questions about the manipulation or buying off of the masses, authoritarian personalities, and so forth. So that's question one: why the extreme anti-democratic retort to manifest inequality, deracination, and depredations under neoliberal capitalism? The second question is, what is the part of neoliberal reason in generating the ethno-nationalism and conservative family values within this anti-democratic retort? And here I'm asking, what has been neglected in previous studies and critiques of neoliberalism, including my own, that focus only on neoliberal economic rationality and consign this other stuff, conservative family values, hierarchies, white supremacy, ethno-nationalism, to other trajectories of power and ideology, what we call neoconservatism or evangelical Christianity and other such things. So here I'm asking, what's the part of neoliberal reason in generating this aspect of the anti-democratic retort to current conditions? The third question is, how does the combination of neoliberal socioeconomic dethronement of white working and middle classes conjoin with traditional values mobilization and an ever-intensifying nihilism to turn or convert so-called conservative values into a more explicit project of attempting to resecure white male supremacy, both at the state and civic level, and restore it at the familial or cultural level? And finally, the fourth question animating the text is, what is the relevance of the fact that instead of a neoliberal utopia, what many of us in the trade have come to call actually existing neoliberalism, generated a political formation that the founding neoliberals themselves would have abhorred. That is, those founders dreamed of a lean, focused, technocratic statism that would facilitate economic competition and support traditional morality. They envisioned a world in which democracy would be limited to voting and the peaceful transfer of power. Legislation would be limited to universal rulemaking and get completely out of the social good or legislating in the public interest business. They envisioned a world of a pacified, depoliticized citizenry, busily taking care of itself and making no demands on the state, which would be in any case an undemocratic institution, leaning more in a technocratic, if not quasi-authoritarian direction. Now, all of this together, they believed, would preserve liberalism and keep fascism and social democracy at bay. But of course, what unfolded instead was a manifestly rigged polity and economy, the one thing the right and the left agree on, plutocracies, rent-seeking economies, myth-mongering demagogues, and affectively charged, politicized masses. In other words, what unfolded is an order no closer to the neoliberal dream than state communism was to Marx's. So my argument is that neoliberalism tilled the ground for an anti-democratic right-wing revolt, and that argument is built both from an examination of the critiques of democracy by the original neoliberals and through trying to think through how, in actually existing neoliberalism, their vision was significantly distorted by forces that they ignored or neglected, from political power to diseducation to the acceleration of nihilism in our time. The argument unfolds across 4 chapters. The first on the dismantling of the social sphere, the second on the neoliberal aim to transform the political sphere and throttle democracy, the third to extend what they called the personal protected sphere, and the fourth on the mobilization of law for all of the above. So very, very briefly, it goes like this. On the social. Neoliberalism aims, and here I'm channeling Hayek, to some degree Friedman, also the order liberals. Neoliberalism aims to dismantle and discredit the social, the realm that Margaret Thatcher, directly citing Hayek, famously declared does not exist, insisting as she did that there are only individuals and their families, no such thing as society. This attempt to dismantle the social or the society in both thought and reality is, of course, to deny the unequal powers that feature the very problem of social justice, and also to deny the order of a common good that democracy is often thought to exist to tend. And this, in turn, changes the meaning and the venue for freedom and for equality in a liberal order. This was precisely the neoliberal aim. Secondly, neoliberalism attacks democracy as a robust political form. This attack involved a critique of popular sovereignty and a critique of the idea that the state itself should be democratic or a medium for justice. Neoliberalism sought to reduce democracy instead, as I've suggested, to a method for a peaceful transfer of power, and it sought to de-democratize the state, which should run in the neoliberal vision on other principles. Notwithstanding their differences, all neoliberals converged on the notion that the state exists to protect individual liberty, to support markets and traditional morality, and to provide security, nothing more. And in protecting these things, liberty, markets, morals, it must not intervene in them. Intervening in them is what all democratically legislated projects of equality, social justice, progressive taxation, regulation, public goods, and social planning do. And that is precisely what they were trying to delegitimate and, indeed, put an end to. The third move, as I suggested, was to try to figure out how to extend the reach of what Hayek called the personal protected sphere. By this he meant replacing democratic legislation with governing by markets and morals through extending both markets and morality to the domain of civic and political life, not simply limiting them to the domain of family and exchange. Hayek was explicit here. The so-called personal protected sphere and the morality and private property claims that go with it had to be moved beyond the family and private ownership. And this is really important. This is what underscores challenges in a neoliberal order to secularism, as well as to equal protection claims all over society. This is what literally privatizes the figure of the nation, making it our home, giving us the right to build walls, exclude others, and figure it in Christian moral terms. In addition, it permits liberty, that cardinal feature of neoliberalism, to be widely mobilized against equality and equal protection, which it does, as we know today, under the rubric of free speech, freedom of conscience, and private property rights for individuals and corporations alike. And the fourth move that's fundamental in this assault on democracy is to facilitate all the previous moves, the dismantling of society, the assault on robust democracy, the transformation of the meaning of democracy, and the extension of the personal protected sphere, the facilitation of all of these moves in law. And we see this today in a Supreme Court majority that brings not, in my argument, merely conservative, but expressly neoliberal jurisprudence to its decisions and argumentation. And I analyze a couple of cases in particular in the text. All right, so to conclude, my argument is that beyond simply empowering markets and traditional morality, these moves together have the effect of consecrating or re-legitimating extant supremacies, right, masculinist, heteronormative, nativist, in the name of morality and freedom. They have the effect of delegitimating counterclaims by so-called social justice warriors, again, a term Hayek himself coined, and they transform the meaning of freedom and justice across neoliberalized borders. Above all, they radically depress the reach and the value of democracy, even casting it as something of an enemy to an order governed by markets and morals. This was the transformation of liberalism, and indeed to some degree the separation of liberalism from democracy, that neoliberalism aimed at, and in part succeeded in instantiating over these last 4 decades. Now, there are other lines of argument in the book. I've omitted the account of how neoliberalism morphed into something of its political opposite. I've omitted the entire discussion of nihilism, with which the book concludes, and its imbrication with what I call wounded white male supremacy. And I've also omitted an extensive discussion of how this book revises my previous arguments about neoliberalism. But I think I've given you enough to at least launch the conversation about what I'm calling the anti-democratic authoritarian liberalism with which we are contending today.
Actually, I think I'm going to stay sitting down, if that's okay. So I'm absolutely delighted to have been invited to engage with Wendy's book. And you know, as I was reading it, I was actually taken back to a dinner we had together. It must have been somewhere around 2017. And I remember vividly Wendy saying that she would much rather be focusing on Marx and religion, but that she felt compelled to work on Trumpism and neoliberalism. And I enormously admire Wendy's political commitment, going back a long way to the trenches of the university battle, but also very much her willingness to go back and revise her earlier work on neoliberalism. And I think that's something very few of us are ever willing to do. But, you know, it's very clear that the urgency of the political moment, you know, has called forth a willingness that's unusual, to say the least, in that. You know, I also really strongly and fully endorse her argument that we have to understand Trumpism as generated through the inner workings of neoliberalism, broadly construed. And I think this is all the more important. This sort of imminent critique is crucial, because there's this very widespread view of Trumpism as a very nasty bunch of basket of deplorables that sort of appeared out of nowhere, and more generally a view of the rise of the right as a recent rude anti-liberal excrescence. And, you know, as one of my colleagues, Stephanie Kipling, has put it, this kind of disdain feeds right back into and amplifies the very forces that it's trying to deal with. So for my own work, I have found the book incredibly productive, provocative, and generative to think with, and I'm going to say to some degree against. And where I'm coming from, and for me, where these questions of the relations between neoliberalism and democracy are nowhere more important than in post-apartheid South Africa, where neoliberalism and democracy happen together. And what has happened is that hopes for widespread social and economic justice have very systematically been eroded. And what we're left with is a sort of an outer shell of liberal democracy, a horrendously unequal, divided populace, and massive growing popular anger that often takes the form of xenophobia and femicide. And, you know, if Trumpism is terrifying and sickening, what has been happening in South Africa is a full-blown tragedy. And this is all to say that there are absolutely huge political stakes in how we think about neoliberalism in relation to the attenuation of democracy and rising authoritarianism. And the way I've read the book and will comment on it really focuses on the question of what is the political work that it's doing. So very quickly, I want to start with an overview of the structure of the book, zeroing in on a couple of things. So it seems to me chapters 1 to 3 really form the theoretical core. For me, they form an incredibly tight, coherent, elegantly woven argument in which Wendy really lays out her insistence that we have to go back to Hayek and recognize that his project was not just government through the market, but also through traditional morality. And how in turn this entails negating the idea of the social and radically restricting the reach of democratic power. But what Wendy also does is make an argument in these first 3 chapters about how the play of markets and morality in actually existing neoliberalism is quite different from what Hayek imagined. And it seems to me the end of chapter 3, there is a key set of arguments, and what Wendy does there is she lays out what she calls 3 key twists away from Hayekian governmentality that are absolutely key to understanding how his dream became a nightmare. And the most important, it seems to me, is the first, and I'm going to quote here, his formula for transitioning from social democracy to a neoliberal order featured political authoritarianism, which could hardly rebuild the bedrock of tradition, organicism, evolution, spontaneity, freedom, even if he touted traditional principles. So in other words, it seems to me what Wendy is doing here is she's pointing to a contradiction at the heart of Hayek's utopia. And again, as she puts it, which crashes on the shoals of the social and political it seeks to vanquish, both theoretically and practically. I think that's a very important thing. Now, you know, when I got to this point in chapter 3, it suddenly explained to me something that had puzzled me in chapter 2. And there's a statement in chapter 2 that workers in the poor have to be tricked, trained, or effectively disenfranchised to prevent them from fighting the unfairness of markets. And this seems to me to represent a major seismic shift in from Wendy's earlier work on neoliberalism, where she invokes Foucault to argue that the neoliberal state is no longer encumbered by the danger of incurring legitimation deficits, precisely because neoliberal rationality governs without recourse to overt rule. And this is a key point that I want to come back to. But before that, I just want to briefly touch on chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4, Speaking Wedding Cakes and Praying Pregnancy Centers, focuses on 2 Supreme Court cases that illustrate really vividly how right-wing Christianity and capitalism have come together to override equal rights legislation. It's an absolutely brilliant, wonderful chapter. It's my favorite chapter. And then chapter 5, that she didn't talk about, No Future for White Men, is really Nietzsche meets Marcuse. It's how nihilism and desublimation come together to produce this Frankensteinian monster that has arisen from high extreme. It's an absolutely dazzling chapter. And you know, as I was reading it, visions of Charlottesville stormtroopers kind of, you know, came up before me, and this really just has them pinned and ripping. So it's dazzling, but it's also bloody terrifying. And I think this is deliberate, that what Wendy's trying to do is to shock and shake us up, and she accomplishes this with her usual panache. But also for me, it raised the question of what political work this is doing beyond forcing us to confront the incredible dangers of the nightmarish conditions that we're living through. And the phrase that sprang to mind to me is that what Wendy is giving us is pessimism of the intellect all the way down. And, you know, I realize Wendy is not and never has been in the business of generating hopeful optimism. But, nevertheless, if we're going to confront the current moment of danger, we really do need to be able to think about where are the weak points in this whole unfolding horror show, where pressure might be exerted. And Wendy made some observations right at the end of the chapter that called forth from me 2 very loud yeses. So the first one, she talks about space. And it's just a couple of pages, but really interesting, insightful observations that left me asking for more. And then there was another point when she's talking about how we need to understand the forces that neoliberalism intersects or instigates. She suggests that we turn to genealogical emergences via Foucault or conjunctures via Stuart Hall. And the invocation of Stuart Hall was my second big yes. So what I want to do is just, as fast as I can, pull out some, try to push these ideas a little bit further. So firstly, on the whole question of space. So it seems to me a key question here is, can we actually grasp the key dynamics that have produced the rise of the right and Trumpism purely or primarily at the national level? And I want to suggest that instead of a second question, instead of a national level analysis, what might it mean to situate the US in a global frame? And what I have in mind here is not just Quinn Slobodian's analysis of neoliberalism as a global project from the get-go, which it certainly is, but rather, but in addition, what would a global conjunctural analysis look like that builds on Hall but goes beyond Hall and Hitch? And this in turn entails thinking of the US as always formed through its relations and connections with other regions of the world. And I would argue that from a non-Western perspective, the rise of right-wing nationalisms and populist politics and authoritarian forms in Europe and the US wasn't a surprise or unexpected. We've actually been watching these processes unfold in many regions of the world, especially since the end of the Cold War, but well before that as well. And it seems to me that from this perspective, the question isn't so much what explains Trumpism, but why did it take so long for a demagogic figure like Trump to ascend to power, given the long history of racism and right Christian nationalism, the ravages of neoliberal capitalism, and the neglect of the working class by the Democratic Party. And I would argue that the answer to that question hinges crucially on recognizing how the neoliberal counter-revolution was part of the emergence of new forms of US imperialism in the 1980s. And this is not just a David Harvey story about accumulation by dispossession, but a set of processes that reconfigured the relationship of the US to different regions of the non-Western world, that has made US neoliberalism distinctively different from anywhere else in the world, and that is, I think, also absolutely crucial to understanding the timing of Trump. So secondly, quickly, I want to turn to Stuart Hall on neoliberalism. And here I think it's really useful to remember that Hall and Foucault were both writing about neoliberalism at exactly the same time in the late 1970s, although in radically different ways. And I want to focus here on how Hall's analysis of Thatcherism is fundamentally different from how Wendy is setting up her analysis via her engagement and critique with Hart. And it seems to me there are two key differences. First turns around the analysis of social democracy that preceded the neoliberal counter-revolution. And what Wendy is in effect doing, it seems to me, is portraying social democracy as a sort of pre-existing ideal type in the West. Hall's conjunctural analysis of social democracy in Britain is very different. And it really is most fully developed in the jointly authored book, Policing the Crisis, which came out in 1978, which argues that the British welfare state was always a compromised and contradictory social formation. And they traced the amplifying crisis of social democracy in Britain from the second half of the 1970s, showing how by the mid-70s, prior to Thatcher, an increasingly authoritarian law and order society had taken hold. And that these forces operated through tension-ridden articulations of race and class. And that it was this that paved the way for Thatcherism and the rise of the right. But Hall also has a very different story about the transition from social democracy to neoliberalism. Instead of coercion and just coercion and force, Hall invokes the concept of authoritarian populism as part of a neoliberal hegemonic project. And so he really holds on to hegemony, but looks at how it got reworked. And I just want to quote a short quote from the great Moving Right show that I think really captures it, where he says, "This populism is not a rhetorical device or a trick. It is operating on genuine contradictions. Its success and effectivity does not lie in its capacity to dupe unsuspecting folk, but the way it addresses real problems and lived experiences, but is able to represent them within a logic of discourse which pulls them systematically into line with the policies and class strategies of the right." And I'm going to stop here, but just very quickly, it seems to me there's another way in which neoliberalism as a project operates via a populist appeal, and that is in relation to the division between intellectual and manual labor. And the philosopher Michael Gray actually has very interesting observations about this. and how this then leads to a denigration of expertise. So just one final point. So I do personally, and certainly in relation to South Africa, but I think it, perhaps more broadly, I have found it really useful to hold on to a concept of neoliberal hegemony, but to distinguish a form of neoliberal hegemony that operates according to efforts to neutralize popular antagonism, which is, I think I would say, the sort of third way, Blair, Mbeki, Obama form, Clinton, as opposed to a populist form of neoliberal hegemony that operates through mobilizing popular antagonism, but then trying to keep them under control. And it seems to me that this is one very important way in which authoritarian forces get unleashed. It also helps us think about the oscillation between third way and populist forms of neoliberalism, which I would argue is characteristic of South Africa today as much as the US, Britain, and so forth. So I'm going to stop there.
So first I'd like to thank Michael for the invitation to speak on this panel. It really is an honor to comment on Wendy's work. And also, I think it's a really timely piece of work that's both timely and I could imagine will be discussed and debated for decades and decades to come. So before I start, I would like to say two things. First, this book is a reminder to never read Wendy Brown while you have the flu or an upper respiratory infection. You do need all of your senses and facilities to understand the complexity and the beauty and the urgency of her prose. And so I want to apologize if my prose is not so coherent today. Second, this book is a reminder for anyone who has ever said or implied anything around the relevance of political theory for the moments that we're living in today. This is precisely the kind of critical analysis based on close readings of historical and contemporary theorists paired with a cogent analysis and a kind of irreverent politics is exactly what we need today. Not just because the state of the world that we're enduring is a sobering one, but also for analyzing and understanding what comes after it, if anything at all, which was the saddest part of the book for me, to kind of think about, is there a post to this? The book is brilliant and you should all read it when you're 100% well. I want to just say quickly what I think some of the contributions are, and then I'll talk a little bit about where I think the book raises some really important questions that I would like to hear Wendy go further and maybe to have a discussion about. So the first one is really that this book digs deep into the ideology of neoliberalism and brings to the fore not just the economic or governance aspects of the project, but its moralism, right? And it also sidesteps entirely, but speaks very much to these debates on the left and within academia still around, is this race or class that caused this catastrophic reality that we're living in? It sidesteps that altogether to a much more nuanced set of questions. It also offers, and I don't know if you wanted to do this, and it's sad that you would have to do this, a radical defense of the social in a context of decades-long campaign to annihilate it, right, along with democratic politics and the political. And finally, it offers this cogent analysis of this political moment that is nuanced and offers a much more satisfying explanation and, I would argue, too, periodization of the current moment, and one that highlights the complicity and outright guilt, I guess, of neoliberal Democrats in bringing about the conditions of possibility of this moment. Something that if you're watching the impeachment trials right now, you'd never know, right? Like there's a sort of like heroic democratic politics that's being held right now that I think this book actually speaks against in terms of the anti-democratic underpinnings of this moment. So I'd like to focus my comments on questions that I think this work provokes. So the first one is around how the past is constructed under this form of neoliberal rationale. So you painstakingly and really respectfully, I think, outline the thinking of Hayek. I actually think this is like a really respectful and deep analysis of Hayek and Friedman and the other people we associate with neoliberal thinking to kind of take who you critique very seriously. And the way you do so is a lesson for how we are to critically engage and to understand the logics and illogics of people that we disagree with. It provides for a more nuanced analysis of the present and how we got here, and it forms the basis of a critique that you build throughout the book, including your defense of the social. So one of the aspects of Hayekian neoliberalism that I had a hard time wrapping my head around is around how they deal with the past. And I appreciate your nuanced discussion of traditional values and the ways that Hayek's arguments about morality actually leave space for change over time and a kind of evolution or Darwinian idea of tradition. At the same time, it didn't answer questions to me about the past and contradictions that the past highlights. And this is the question I have for Hayek, for you, and for the populist right today. So in the minds of people like Hayek and trumpeters more generally, there is this idea that in a context where you dismantle the social and the political, you need to ward off any sort of social engineering, right, or social justice warriors kind of speak, or any kind of social welfare-oriented government action. Of course, this is social engineering, but what about the past? How about how we think about the social engineering of the past? How do they reconcile that? So in the book, you toggle back and forth between the ideal type of neoliberal rationale and reality. And one of the inconvenient realities seems to be that the world that they've inherited, that they're trying to shift, is a world that's constructed through all kinds of social engineering. And so how do we make sense of that? And is there any attempts towards coherence or resolving that contradiction? So how is it possible that fair housing policies are engineering when redlining is not? The Voting Rights Act is social engineering, but generations of white privilege and gerrymandering is not. I don't know if this is just a contradiction that's just left there, or if there's ways to kind of think about their attempts to resolve those. Second, and this echoes Jill's comments, is if the Global South has any lessons for us in terms of how we're to characterize neoliberalism. So reading this book as someone who studies Latin America, a region that is often thought about as the laboratory of the kind of neoliberalism, and specifically the economic neoliberalism that Wendy talks about in this book, I could not help but to think about what happens in the ruins of neoliberalism in these cases, and what, if anything, they leave us in terms of hope for the future. So in the ruins of the first wave of neoliberal policies in this region and marketization of many aspects of social life in Latin America, many through authoritarian regimes, as you talk about in the book, what does prevail is a kind of what Peter Evans, one of my mentors, called counter-hegemonic globalization, right? So in the wake of devastating inequalities, migration, hunger, and uneven development that Latin Americans experienced under neoliberal reforms, they hit the streets and they demanded a rolling back of these policies. This is where indigenous movements and student movements met on the streets, where peasants and urban workers came together to denounce neoliberalism. And in the 1990s and 2000s, this is where Latin Americans famously, or infamously, depending on where you stand politically, elected leftist governments that engaged in what were ultimately modest but very important forms of redistribution. This is also where you see some of the earliest and biggest mobilizations against a particular kind of globalization, right? And so what we see, though, what happens next year is really sobering. So the current right turn in Brazil stands out in this sense. When we think about this, we're reminded that left-leaning governments in Latin America tried to mitigate the most disastrous effects of capitalism and neoliberal capitalism within rather than outside of the terms of capitalism itself. And when they tried to put checks on the expansion of markets into every aspect of social and environmental life, when governments engaged in what Polanyi famously called the double movement, capital and those that benefit most from its expansion responded with a vengeance. So a Brazil for everyone under Lula became a loved homeland under Bolsonaro. The Latin American cases also remind us that while rights and mainstream social democratic policies may seem meager to radical scholars and to some activists, they are threatening enough to the functions of political power and capital accumulation and to the sensibilities of the racially dominant that they are systematically and often violently dismantled. And I think the convergence of countries like Brazil and the US today, even after a much more expansive redistribution, and given that Brazilian elites have very tenuous ties to whiteness, makes me even more cynical about the future, in fact. The third question that I think your book raises is about this concept of dethroned male white hegemony, supremacy. In my interpretation, there's this thread in the book that seems to be trying to explain not just the rise of Trump, of course, but Trumpism, and which is engaged with people like Arlie Hochschild's work and others who've tried to understand not just the ideology that undergirds Trumpism, but also the affect. And in this analysis, the book seems to always turn to this archetype of the right-wing white nationalist populace, which is the white working class or poor, rural or midlander man who has in some way experienced the devastating impact of deindustrialization and the race to the bottom and other neoliberal economic reforms at the same time that they felt this kind of devaluation of their whiteness. And I understand the attention to this demographic, and I also appreciate the nuanced discussion of nihilism, futurity, and white men. However, I want to know if focusing too much attention on this specific demographic, or even on white evangelicals, if by doing so we miss whiteness, whiteness is more broad functioning under this current moment. We know that white people across nearly every demographic, probably not on this campus or in this room, but every other demographic. Let's see, I lost my place. Including white women, voted Trump into power. We also know that white evangelicals were able to get past the adultery and sexual assault and what is objectively anti-Christian behavior by Trump to elect him, which all seems to point to the fact that there are alliances of whiteness that are at work here. Alliances that are getting consolidated and that do function around this concept of injured whiteness. I don't know if this, though, is dethroned whiteness or white maleness, but rather it's opposite. The fact that it is arguably pronounced among rural white men the most, though, even though I think that's somewhat debatable, may have to do with the fact that there's the value and reconfiguration of value under neoliberalism is really what's happening. So where whiteness gains value and how it's valuing. So Marx famously talked about workers under capitalism having nothing left to bring to market but their labor power, right? Perhaps rather than white male privilege being dethroned or even wounded, I want to suggest that the stripping away of economic stability for some white workers and poor whites has actually left white men in this category to have nothing but their white maleness to bring to market or to politics, which, you know, under neoliberalism are similar things. So this brings me to this passage on page 63 where you say, unless they are trained, and you talked about this one, I think it's really important, trained or effectively disenfranchised, the workers and the poor will always fight markets as unfair in their distribution of opportunities and rewards. This class has been tricked, however, with appeals to other lines of privilege and power, such as whiteness or masculinity, especially since liberty, rather than equality, reproduces and secures those power, unquote. And so I wonder if this kind of analysis that sounds a little like a false consciousness analysis among white poor folks and workers underestimates the symbolic, psychic, and even material effects of whiteness, and white maleness in particular. It reminds me of Cheryl Harris's famous argument about whiteness as property. White men, especially the dispossessed and deindustrialized, seem happy in Trump's America, not because they are among the handful of those who have gotten jobs through protectionist, anti-neoliberal negotiations and photo ops, but because they're white and male. Without some of the material privileges that go with that identity, they seem like they needed Trump to feel better about themselves. And I say this all to say that I believe that centering the political economy of whiteness rather than centering neoliberal rationale and adding racism, nihilism, fatalism, resentment, and stirring might also give us a different tilt on these questions. It may lead us to different readings of a dethroned white maleness. It means asking what happens to whiteness when, in some cases, it gets slightly dislodged from certain kinds of economic privilege. And what happens when the effects of neoliberalism democratize economic oppression? What happens when everyone is a Negro now, as some people have said, or the world is a ghetto, as Howie Winott famously said? What does that do to whiteness? It perhaps builds a more durable throne rather than dethrone it. In talking about the rise of fatalism and nihilism, you say, quote, "If white men cannot own democracy, there will be no democracy. If white men cannot rule the planet, there will be no planet." And I think you mean their discourse rather than reality, right? But the irony here is that, of course, white men do still very much own democracy. And they do very much still rule the planet. And if we have any doubts about that, we only need to look to the rooms full of white men in charge of basically legislating policy around maternal health, when 0% of them are likely to die in pregnancy or birth, and in a context where black women are 3 times as likely to die as white women in pregnancy or birth. So in the ruins of neoliberalism raises a number of really important questions about whiteness, masculinity, its materiality, its discourse, its symbolic power, its affects, and I think most interestingly, how it might ultimately emerge from what it perceives as attacks on itself, right? So my question though is racism fuel to this fire, or is it the fire itself? And so finally, my final question is what happens next? And I'm only asking you this because you asked this in the book. So finally you end the book with this question, and I think it's a really important one and a daunting one. It says, nation, family, property, and the traditions reproducing racial and gender privilege, mortally wounded by deindustrialization, neoliberal reason, globalization, digital, technological, and nihilism, are reduced to affective remains. And I really like this concept of affective remains. To date, these remains have been activated mostly by the right. What kind of left political critique and vision might reach and transform them, end quote. And so I'd like you to try to answer the daunting but necessary question. Is there anything redeemable or salvageable in the ruins of neoliberalism? Are there processes of subject formation or affect that do remain, that can be built on in a different kind of way? Thank you so much.
Questions raised by both Tianna and Jill. So why don't we give Wendy a few minutes to address some of the issues they surfaced.
Okay. A very few. First of all, these are amazing comments. Maybe that's why I don't like hearing them. I mean, just amazing. They're both such deep and substantive engagements, and I found myself agreeing with almost every word. And I don't by that mean the praise, I mean the critical engagement and the challenges. I really do. They were amazing. So let me just say a very few things. I will not deal with all of them. First, since both of you cited the sentence about workers being tricked or trained, or what was the third one? Effectively disenfranchised. I was actually channeling Hayek, and I suppose I didn't make that clear, that I was not saying that's what needed to happen, that what Hayek argues and the order liberals argued, really Friedman's the only outlier here. He didn't worry about it so much, and it's probably because of the American context. But the worry they had is that if you really had universal enfranchisement, you would automatically have a social state, and if you had because that's what it would be demanded. And if you had a social state, you would have a redistributive state and a social justice state, and if you had that, in Hayek's view, you were on the road to totalitarianism. And the destruction of markets and the destruction of traditional morality, because there would be all kinds of claims for social justice. So you had to make these other moves. But I see that in the penning of the sentence, especially because I started to then suggest all the ways in which that tricking and training and effective buying off happened, that I fell right into the Hayekian pit of suggesting that this had to happen in an open and overt way. But that's a minor point. The major questions that both of you offer, I want to put in conversation with each other. It seems to me that Jill has asked for something like a transnational neoliberal, a transnational or if not global analysis of the conjuncture that neoliberalism, anti or post-colonialism, struggles against racism, and we could add the climate crisis, have brought us to, that has produced particular kinds of right-wing or authoritarian movements. Produced lots of other things too. But then on the other hand, it seems to me that what you've suggested and reminded us of, which comes a little closer to the view that I have, is that neoliberalism was never rolled out as a universal thing. It had layers, it had iterations, it had epochs. It was slammed into the global south in a very different way than it was unfurled entirely through soft power, but much more through what I've focused on in my own work, which is the transformation of liberalism, a liberalism in many cases never deep in the fibers of Latin America, let alone South Africa. And that transformation is what I've always been focused on in my work, even as I've made gestures toward an Erdogan or a Bolsonaro or other things. The analysis, I don't think, can be universal, even though I think there are links, both in some of the dangerous political formations and obviously in some of the forms of resistance and rebellion. And some of these links are literal, they're communicated to one another, as are so many of the forms of rebellion, and I mean literal in the sense that they are they're actually they're cries and calls and forms of resistance that are taken up by people in relation to what they see happening elsewhere in the world. And some of them do have to do with what I think Jill is bringing out, which is the dimensions of this that are global. But I think it's a mistake to have a global or universal account of neoliberal formations politically, economically, and socially, even as it's enormously important to focus on the kinds of things that somebody like Quinn Slobodian and comparativists focus on, which is the extent to which this was always a global project, has had global implications. But its lived reality, politically, socially, culturally, is going to be different in different regions because of what it's intermixing within those regions. Okay, so that would be in part my response to Jill about the danger of the global conjunctural analysis. The one other thing, I guess the other thing I have to say to Jill is this. I find it very hard to criticize Stuart Hall in public because I love him so much, and we're all so grateful to the formation that he gave so many of us. But I actually deeply disagree with the analysis in policing the crisis, even as I've learned from it enormously, and that's why I didn't touch it here. But you've reminded me about the early anticipation of the populist project that he saw in it that I need to go back to. So I've avoided engaging with him in my work for the love reasons I just mentioned. But at the same time, you're reminding me that I actually still need to go back and learn from things. So I appreciate that, and I have to find out who Michael Bray is, the philosopher you mentioned. Okay, I should know, but I don't. Now, to Tianna's amazing questions, the only thing I think I want to do is say this. I never meant to say that racism was fuel to the fire. I meant to say that neoliberalism was fuel to the racism. And by that I mean that A, it did transform the condition of working class and middle class whites in the global north, as the neoliberals knew that it would, once they smashed the unions and opened up global routes for labor and capital. They knew that that would be a sinking of those populations, and imagined that they could solve that problem through political pacification in the way that Hayek describes it. But that racist reaction on the part of that sinking population, I'm suggesting, fueled an already simmering, existent racism. But then I also want to suggest that the racist reaction, as I talk about it in the book, was of course also fueled by certain aspects of development within liberalism and globalism, immigration. You know, we have an overdetermined situation here, but I did not mean to say that it was racism was just a little fuel to the fire. I was actually trying to get it.
For what it's worth, I think you say that it's, my interpretation would be that it's a lot of fuel, not just a little, but it's a question of like emphasis.
Yes, but to the really big point that you make, I think that I probably spend too much time on those dethroned, angry, socially castrated white guys, and too little time on the phenomenon of whiteness as you've depicted it. And I think that's right. At the same time, I want to suggest that what we see in Trumpism is certainly the constellation that what we see in Trumpism is certainly a direct address to that you've been thrown down, I'm going to raise you back up. But at the same time, well, let me just make this last point. When I said if white men can't own democracy, there will be no democracy. If they can't rule the planet, there will be no planet, and was referring to the open assault on democracy and on the planet in the denial of the climate crisis that we see coming from that population. I was suggesting that of course they still own it, of course they still rule it, but there's also a manifest threat to that ownership and rule in the form of slowly, haltingly, unevenly transforming North-South relations and race relations within the North. Demographic changes, the very condition of the Republican Party that knows its constituency is shrinking, 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 and consequently has reacted by essentially becoming overtly anti-democratic rather than tacitly so, rather than aristocratic, rather than merely Tocquevillian in its style of worrying about how to constrain or contain democracy, or federalist. So I still, I guess, want to stand with the point that the experienced threat, not just from multicultural discourse or so-called political correctness, but of the shrinking sandbar, matters in the animus, the spirit, and the content of the anti-democratic and nihilistic relationship to the planet and to the existential crisis that we see in the hard right. And that's an insufficient account of whiteness. You're, of course, right about that. Okay, enough from me. Let's hear from other people. You said a lot more, but I want to do more. Okay.
Okay, super. I'm going to actually use that one. So it's a crowded room, and we'll take maybe 3 questions at a time. I might rely on you to help me circulate the mic. So one here.
Thank you. My name is Sam Chang. I'm based in Taiwan. I'm president of the Negative Vote Association, and I have a solution for the rise of extremism and populism that I can offer for you to consider. The solution is very simple. Let voters have the choice to vote against a candidate instead of for. and have such against vote counted as -1. Each voter still has only one vote. That's very important, because when you still have only one vote, all the partisan loyal voters will vote yes. They will be asked by the candidate to vote yes. So the people who are likely to vote no are the middle electorate. And when you have only one vote, you will vote against the extremist. And this will definitely increase participation. In the last presidential election, we worked with the RAND Corporation, which in their national survey, it showed had this option been available, it would have increased participation rate by 7.2 percentage points for the United States. And, not surprisingly, Trump would have received net negative vote of 3.9%. Okay? So we believe this should be a basic right. If you look up how the UN Secretary General is elected, the option to vote against is already available.
Great. Can we ask you to wrap it up?
Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Christian Possan. I'm a second-year PhD student in political science. I have two quick questions I'm going to run through. So there seems to be a historical argument that's embedded in your book about the turn to an anti-democratic state. But I wanted to know if you could think about or engage with someone like Robert McKee's work, who kind of argues that the Jim Crow South is in fact kind of under one-party authoritarian rule throughout the entirety of the kind of the late 19th century to the early 20th century. And I'm wondering how you might think about, kind of an imagination in which we actually never had democracy in the United States. So that's the first question. The second one is about finance capitalism. And how do we think about neoliberal hegemony in the context of a number of policies that really, for lack of a better term, like rig the system? So thinking about regressive taxation, housing discrimination, and these things are oftentimes seen as excesses or legislative excess in terms of these things shouldn't be happening, but in many ways they actually fit really well under neoliberal hegemony. And so how do we think about these kinds of a neoliberal turn in the context of a number of policies that have been in existence for decades that have really kind of shaped the lives, oftentimes of communities of color, in ways that are really designed to both hurt them, but also to kind of prop up capital.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's one of the listening to this, just so inspiring. It reminds me so much of what I love about Berkeley. Being here, really, just thank you all for that inspiration. The two elements that kind of follow up on the last question, some of the things that Jill rose as well. Actually, all three are two things. One is the failure in this becomes a failure of liberal democracy rather than the question of what's a failure that pre-existed that within liberalism. Thinking histories of white property, patriarchy, that are constituent of the very understandings of liberalism, that isn't just a failing of liberal democracies at this moment or this later moment and neoliberalism, but in a sense much more all the way down. I just wanted to hear that element of a deeper critique of liberalism, what that might add. It may bring in some of the questions where questions of race and empire might enter into the analysis in the first place, and there's no the neoliberal or the liberal democracy dream wasn't ever that because of that frame. So I guess I'll stop with that, but just ask that kind of broader question of a critique of liberalism that's constituent to this.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it seems like there might be one more question. We probably have time for one more.
Yeah. Okay, super in the front.
We might have time for another. I'm going to be brief.
Oh, okay, all right.
Okay, my interpretation of what you've written is that you're saying that neoliberalism, apart from just being a philosophy of Hayek and others, is in fact an intersubjective reality that has kind of played out in society, in the thoughts and feelings and kind of tacit emotional responses of a whole bunch of people, and then that intersubjective reality is kind of driving this hard right. I wonder if you have any comments on the so-called dark intellectual web as one kind of manifestation of a kind of a very vocal and visible end of the thinking in this intersubjective reality.
All right. Back corner for one final.
Yeah, this is a question for Wendy. How do you see the place of nationalism in the neoliberal project? Because there seems to be an interesting partial overlap and partial tension there. And in a certain sense, the Trump phenomenon represents that tension. What I mean specifically, a little bit more specifically, is that in neoliberalism, what happens is that the economy gets conceptualized in extremely formal terms. Everything that is substantive about the economy gets completely emptied away and jettisoned. Whereas in economic nationalism, there's a very important emphasis on some of the elements of substantive components of what a national economy and an international economy, in fact, is or are. So I would like you to comment a little bit on this very interesting issue, because in a way neoliberalism, I mean, you can conceptualize neoliberalism as essentially a suicidal prescription for any nation that attempts to implement it. And the worst enemies of the United States, the best way for them to proceed is actually to prescribe a complete and total sort of exercise of the neoliberal agenda in the United States. It will devastate the country completely.
Do we have time for one more?
I just want to re-ask Tianna's question that is your own question about what kind of left political critique might reach and transform people, society, affective remains, etc.
There's no way I'm going to answer all of these. So first, let me thank Sam for the negative voting suggestion, and say that every time it goes by, I'm intrigued by it. I do think you're right that it would be the only thing that would guarantee an outcome in 2020 that most people in this room would be able to breathe a sigh of relief about. So that's all I have to say about that. That doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, but I see why we're drawn to it right now. I don't have anything to say about the dark web. I know people in this room who do, but it's not me, even though it's interesting. I will say I don't treat neoliberalism just as an intersubjective reality, but rather both as a set of economic policies and as a form of governing reason that, as Thatcher herself put it, has as its aim remaking the soul, not just the economic conduct of the human being. And as Hayek and several of the ordo-liberals put it, she's always lovely, isn't she? As Hayek and several of the ordo-liberals put it, has to do with remaking our very understanding and practices of liberalism in a radically new way. And that's why I pay so much attention to the reformatting of the social, the political, the democratic, and the traditional moral. So those questions aside, Christopher, of course, you're right about both the importance of work like McKee's on the Jim Crow South. Finance capitalism is another story. Finance capitalism is another thing that the founding neoliberals hadn't given a thought to as governing our globe today. Yes, some of it has explicit as it's, it can be thought of in terms of managing populations, a form of biopolitics and a form of racialized biopolitics. But at the same time, I think we need to think about it as a form of political and economic order beyond the control of any and all that we have to figure out whether and how we can put back in the bottle. It's really different from neoliberal rationality. It's now a set of incomparably large and potent powers that could, as we know, crash the entire planet overnight. In the same way that just a few other things in history have had the capacity to do, namely nuclear weapons and now climate change. I'm getting quickly to what kind of left, so I'm trying to move through the other things. The point about nationalism and neoliberalism as substantive versus formal economics, I guess I have a long, sustained, complex disagreement with that account, even though I understand what you're getting at. I thought you were going somewhere else, which was to think about the place of nationalism within contemporary neoliberalism after the global project, but that's not where you were going, so I won't answer that question. Okay, finally, Jake, and then to the left. The risk of talking about the crisis of democracy is always that one acts or risks acting as if there was a golden age prior to this one. And I try to avoid that in my work over and over. I try to say in the preface and every chapter and the end, it's not as if democracy did not, liberalism in particular, and liberal democracy did not have historical exclusions, bourgeois investments, all kinds of internal failures and inherent failures that are not incidental but simply have to do with its bourgeois form, its racialized and genocidal, in some cases, foundations, its gendered structure, and of course, its reproduction of class. So I spent the first 25 years of my academic life relentlessly criticizing liberalism and liberal democracy, and I've spent the last 10 thinking about what's happening to it right now, and I feel like, this is, a high-class complaint, but I feel like I somehow want to urge readers to say, to trust that I know better, but I think I have to just keep restating, I know what's wrong with liberalism, I know what's wrong with democracy as it's been practiced. I am not willing to give up on the dream of peoples ruling themselves, which is the basic meaning and principle of democracy, and ruling themselves through political equality, which is so different from what we have ever had in modernity, in liberal democracy, that it's putting us on a new footing. That brings us to the final point, what kind of left? Look, it's everywhere. I actually think when I wrote this book, I was deep in the darkness that most of us were inhabiting in the aftermath of 2015, 2016, Brexit, the rise of the right throughout the Middle East and or Near East and Europe, and then in turn Trump, and then Bolsonaro, and on and on. So now, what do we see? We see rebellions that are taking sharper and sharper form as explicit challenges to the values of neoliberalism all the way down. And by that I mean the values that have to do with treating human beings and human endeavor as human capital and simply as a site for individual or familial enhancement. The values that have attacked or assaulted society, and yeah, I guess I did feel like I had to defend the importance of the social after 30 years of it being attacked. The value of ruling ourselves together in common and engaging in rule that also at the same time decenters and dethrones the human in relationship to the other species that share the planet. And I feel like that those movements have precisely emerged from the affective remains of the ruins of neoliberalism. I mean, one way to tell the story in the US is that in the aftermath of 2008, you get Occupy, and Occupy gives rise to the possibility of a Bernie Sanders, which gives rise to the possibility of an AOC, which gives rise in turn to the legitimacy, the absolute legitimacy now in mainstream political conversation of talking about the importance of the planet over economic growth. So I feel like we are now in the throes of those left possibilities articulated by social movements, by leaders, by ordinary people all over the place that I was not prepared to see on my horizon or articulate as the signs of hope at the end of 2017 when I guess I finished the book. You know how books always take a year and a half to get into the world. So I feel like it's here, it's among us, and it's up to each of us to try to figure out how to hitch our wagons to the other wagons and be part of that. That is the only hope for the planet. Am I a pessimist? Sure. Are all of us in this room? Sure. Do we have a lot of hope that we really are going to get this climate crisis under control before it takes us with it? No. Do we have a lot of hope? Do we have a lot of hope that we really are going to be able to get finance capitalism back in the bottle and start thinking about how we can produce political economies that are sustainable for the planet and for the human and other species? No. Should we try? And are there lots and lots of people now awake to the importance of trying? Yes. That's what we got. That's what we are. Thank you.